like I said, oyster mushroom's not looking to find an oil field to eat, but it's more than willing to do that, if you can create the right environment and create a nice hospitable, moisture and temperature and humidity and everything for that mycelium to grow, it will gladly tear those hydrocarbons down to base salts and release the gases and eat those sugars right out of the hydrocarbon.
Are there any efforts to try to, I don't know, capitalize on that in the sense of like these oil spills you hear about that happen fairly frequently, that seems like a great environmental way to try to clean it up and have minimal impact.
Definitely. We've assisted in a couple projects around Humboldt County. One that we did, the reports on our website, fungifarm.com. Out in Orleans, the Mid-Klamath Watershed Council recently took ownership of this building back in 2011, right downtown in Orleans in northeast Humboldt County. And behind the building was a backup generator and a diesel fuel storage tank that had been leaking for years and had caused the ground to become saturated with diesel fuel. And so that fuel was excavated and layered with that contaminated soil, was layered with mycelium that we grew for them, through, sort of like a lasagna compost pile, through, with the soil and treated and with the oyster mycelium to break the hydrocarbons down. And they were able to not have to dispose of the soil, which is unfortunately like often the cheapest default method that people do, is just to take the soil and put it in a class B lined landfill, in this case down south or over east in Redding. We don't even have a landfill anymore in Humboldt County, but again, you're burying these hydrocarbons in this extremely anaerobic environment in the ground
Which
where
doesn't solve anything.
biology can't get to.
Yeah.
And it's our capitalistic culture that thinks we're throwing something away when there is no away. That's just somebody else's watershed, and you can pretty much put a ticking time bomb on when that'll end up in their water system. Maybe it's 200 years, maybe it's 2,000 years, but that's not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And another beautiful thing about the project was that it was Karuk tribal land and ancestral land right there. And they needed to monitor the soil disturbance of that area. It was right next to the Klamath River. And that soil would have had to been sifted through for, archaeologically, significant area. That soil would have been sifted through for artifacts. And so it wasn't even really a great option to throw it away, So to get back to answering your question, so, there are other remediation techniques where they, steam the soil, ozonate the soil, expose the soil to air, sunlight, let the chemicals break down that way. There's solvent, there's that they can pour in that are kind of like what the mycelium produces. Some of them, they dissolve the chemicals and will help them break down, and then allow nature to then do its magic and break it down enough to be non-toxic for the site. A lot of times they pour concrete over it and just cap it. That's another like legal method. If it's not leaching into groundwater or
Oh
whatever,
wow.
they'll case it with concrete, seal it. Depends on the location and where it's at. So, it's to answer your question about why isn't it done more? Why isn't it capitalized on? There is a couple companies that have patented this technology. So that's one of the, roadblocks. There's also the mindset that we have that everything's going to be really fast, and digging it up and hauling it away is really fast. Our project out in Orleans and another project we did for a local landowner, she wanted to remediate some motor oil that had spilt on our property. Both these projects took 2 years to complete, and so a lot of times people propose soil removal or solvents or whatever that are supposed to treat the problem faster. Not necessarily cheaper. It's sort of like clean energy. As the price of fossil fuels go up, the price of solar panels come down, we see more clean energy being produced, right? It's the same thing with ecological methods like this. The higher cost for landfill disposal, removal, hazardous waste permits, all that stuff starts driving the technology for people to look for other answers. Landfills filling up and closing down, and people not wanting to build more landfills. So these are things that I think will drive the need for more on-site biological solutions.
What are the byproducts that the fungi are releasing, in this case, as they're breaking down the oil and
Yeah.
stuff?
Well, one of the misconceptions I should probably clarify too is when we talk about fungal remediation, we're primarily in this instance with the hydrocarbons, we're talking about just growing mycelium. There's no
Hmm.
fruiting bodies. Again, the mushroom itself, the fruiting body you see, the portobello you buy at the store is the fruiting body. We're not fruiting oyster mushrooms in most cases. So when the mycelium comes in contact with the hydrocarbons, they're doing the same thing they're doing to the lignins in the wood. The hyphae secretes the enzymes. The enzymes slowly start dissolving the hydrocarbon molecules, and they want to get that sugar out of there, just like they want to get that sugar, that carbohydrate out of the lignins in the wood. They want to get that carbohydrate out. So what you end up is there's gases that are produced. There's water, obviously, in oil, and there's salts. And so when all said and done, you're back to these base minerals in the soil, gases that have been released, and water that's been produced.
Now, when you say these mushrooms aren't producing fruit, is that by design? Are you guys using a mushroom that doesn't fruit, or is that just the type of mushroom that would break down these hydrocarbons?
Yeah, we're actually using our favorite white commercial oyster mushroom that we grow for food because it's
Hmm.
just so aggressive. But we're in the two projects that we supplied the mycelium for. They never produced fruiting environment for the mushroom. So we never created the environment where the mushrooms would be fruiting. We covered it with plastic, the time of year, the humid, the temperatures in the pile. A woman was doing an experiment with some contaminated soil in Arcata, and she did it like right at the perfect time of the year last fall, and she used so much straw that the pile actually fruited mushrooms. It's a beautiful picture, and people like that. That's so exciting, and there's nothing wrong with that, because of course the mushrooms will attract insects, and the insects will attract birds, and the whole evolution of life is starting again, just like we were kind of I was talking about with that bird's eye view of fungi's role in ecosystems. And so that's a beautiful process, but we're really focusing on in the projects we did of not leaching the piles from rain, not having any people having access to the contaminated soils, and really trying to contain this environment by covering everything with plastic and opening it up to breathe and watering it when needed and stuff like that. So in those cases, we just didn't create those conditions to fruit the mushrooms, which is not what we were striving for.
Hmm. If you guys did want to fruit the mushrooms, would you be able to eat them where they're feeding off those hydrocarbons, or would that not play a
Yeah,
role in that?
that's a good question, Nick. I've read a few articles on this, and uh, if if there was no heavy metals in the motor oil, or in, which there often is, if there's like a generator or it's used motor oil or whatever, there is metals from the engine, that was working as the oil was in there with, with all the gears and everything.
Mm-hmm.
And so the interesting, thing about fungi is, they are full of protein and minerals, contrary to what we thought, 100 years ago or whatever about mushrooms. They're loaded with nutrients and vitamins and minerals. Those minerals that they bioaccumulate, just like mycorrhizal fungi will accumulate those to trade with trees, they'll also pump those up into their fruiting bodies. And so mushrooms have been looked at as a means of bioaccumulation for heavy metals and radioactive isotopes, out of contaminated areas. Again, you have to create those fruiting conditions, so that's much more tricky than just growing the mycelium. So, say for instance, that Orleans project, yes, there was clean diesel fuel that had soaked into the ground, but there was also a generator right there that had been leaking motor oil,
Yeah.
and then what else was happening in that parking lot out there?
Yeah. Yeah, you wouldn't want that in your system.
Was there burn piles? Was there, trash barrels? I don't know what happened in the last 200 years in that backyard there. So you would have to do a metals test. You would want to test the fruiting bodies themselves. And it definitely was a concern that you don't want someone walking by the pile and being like, look, oyster mushrooms.
Mm-hmm.
So we had signs up about what the project was, and, that it was hazardous and waste.